He didn't leave a name. She didn't ask. Weeks later, her entire world changed. It was one of those nights where the rain didn't just fall, it settled in heavy and steady like it had something to say. On a forgotten stretch of highway in Kansas, a lone truck rolled to a stop in front of a small garage. No neon signs, no service bell, just a dim porch light flickering like it too was tired. Inside Ellie, Carson wiped grease from her hands and stepped into the storm without a word. The man standing by the truck was soaked to the bone, engine steaming like it had given up. He didn't ask for help, but she offered it anyway. She worked on that truck for hours. No questions, no small talk, just the rhythm of wrenches and the sound of her breath mixing with the rain. When it finally roared back to life, the man reached for his wallet. "Just get home safe," she said softly, shaking her head. He stared at her for a moment like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just nodded, climbed into the cab, and drove off into the night. Weeks later, a flatbed trailer arrived out of nowhere. Brand new tools, top-of-the-line equipment, and a handwritten letter. No sender, no explanation. Only then did Ellie begin to realize not every act of kindness goes unnoticed. Some echo back, louder than we expect. Ellie Carson wasn't the kind of person people talked much about. She didn't want to be. Most days, she preferred the company of engines over people, the quiet clank of tools over conversation. Her garage sat just outside of Lanesville, a town too small for chain stores but big enough for folks to still wave at each other from across the street. Ellie had taken over the shop after her father passed, fixing up old engines the same way he taught her, slow, steady, and always honest. The place was nothing fancy. Just 4 cracked concrete walls, a tin roof that groaned when it rained, and shelves lined with tools older than some of her customers. But it was hers. Every scratch on the workbench, every oil stain on the floor, they told her story. She didn't make much. Some weeks barely covered rent. But that didn't matter. This wasn't about money. It never had been. "As long as I can fix something that's broken," she once told a neighbor, "then I guess I'm still holding things together." And in a way she was, even if no one really saw it. Most days looked the same for Ellie. She'd unlock the shop just after sunrise, coffee in one hand, a grease rag in the other. The garage always smelled like rubber and metal, something old and familiar like the scent had settled into the walls and refused to leave. By 9 a.m., the first car might roll in, maybe a pickup with a rattling axle or a retired school bus needing brakes. She didn't ask questions, just listened to the sound it made, the way it coughed or stuttered. Machines had a language of their own, and Ellie had long since learned how to listen. Lunch came and went without fuss, usually something simple at her workbench, half a sandwich, an old thermos of soup, maybe a few pages of a novel she'd been reading for months. Then it was back to work. Back to bolts and belts, sockets, and silence. Days like that didn't bother her. In fact, she preferred them. No drama, no noise, just honest work and the quiet kind of satisfaction that only comes from fixing what's broken. Still, every now and then when the shop got too quiet, she'd catch herself staring at the empty chair across the room. The one her father used to sit in, and she'd wonder, "Is this it? Is this all there is for me?" The chair wasn't the only thing she'd kept. Hanging by the back wall just above the toolbox her dad built from scrap metal was his old military jacket. A faded green canvas patches-worn thin sleeves permanently creased at the elbows. On the chest, still stitched after all these years, were the letters P. Carson, USMC. It hadn't been washed since the day he left the hospital. Ellie couldn't bring herself to do it. The smell was long gone, replaced by oil and dust, but it still held something. Memory, maybe. Weight. Every so often, when the shop was still, she'd catch herself standing in front of it, not touching, just looking, as if the jacket might speak, or move, or tell her what to do next. That jacket had seen more of the world than she ever had. War zones, deserts, long highways between states. Her father never talked much about those days, but when he did, it was always the same thing. Doesn't matter what uniform you wear, kid. What matters is who you stop for. Ellie never forgot that. even if lately she wasn't sure what she was stopping for anymore. It started as a soft tapping on the garage roof, just a few drops, nothing urgent. Ellie barely noticed it at first. She was under the hood of a rusted-out Chevy, tightening a bolt that wouldn't quite hold. But within minutes the tapping became drumming, then pounding, a full Kansas downpour, the kind that makes everything smell like wet dirt and worn-out rubber. She stepped outside to pull the bay door down just in time to catch a pair of headlights cutting through the storm. A semi was limping its way into the lot, big rig red cab engine, coughing like a smoker on his last breath. It rolled to a stop just shy of the puddle forming near the drainpipe. The door creaked open and a man climbed down. He moved slowly like the rain had weight. Flannel shirt, soaked hair matted to his forehead, boots sloshing through the mud. He didn't wave, didn't ask for help. Just stood there staring at the garage like it was the last place on earth that might still be open. Ellie looked at him for a long moment, and then, without a word, she reached for the door handle and said quietly, "Come on in, let's see what we can do." Inside the garage was warmer than the storm outside, but only just. The overhead light flickered once, then held steady, casting a yellow glow over the workbench and the rows of tired tools along the walls. Ellie handed the man a dry towel. He nodded, took it without a word, and rubbed rain from his hands. Still, no introductions, no small talk. She lifted the hood on his truck, already knowing where to look. It was instinct, years of fixing things that didn't belong to her machines that told stories just by how they broke. He stood off to the side, quiet, watching her. Not hovering, not helping, just watching. The rain clattered harder on the roof, drowning out everything except the occasional click of her wrench and the soft grunt she made when a bolt refused to give. Half an hour passed like that. Two strangers in a storm sharing silence and stubborn metal. It wasn't the first time Ellie had worked like this. But something about the way he watched, steady, like he recognized something, made her glance up once, then look away. "Fuel pump's bad," she finally said. "Give me time." The man just nodded, and for a reason she couldn't name, Ellie wanted to finish the job right. The tools in Ellie's hand felt heavier that night. Maybe it was the storm, or the silence, or the way the man stood there without ever asking when it would be done. But something about the moment made her mind drift to another night long ago. She had been 17, standing exactly where she stood now, her father beside her guiding her hand as she tried to loosen a corroded bolt on a Ford that hadn't run in years. "Don't rush it," he'd said. "Steady and patient. Machines have their own rhythm. Listen to them." That night had been stormy, too. Thunder rattled the roof. Rain tapped out its steady beat on the window panes, and in between all of it she'd learned how to wait, how to feel the machine breathe. Now, all these years later, her hands moved without thinking, same bolts, same smells, same rhythm. Only this time, she was alone. She glanced up at the stranger again. He was still there, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "You do this by yourself?" he asked finally, breaking the quiet. She nodded once, wiping sweat from her brow with the edge of her sleeve. "Most days." He didn't say anything more, but somehow that short exchange felt louder than the storm outside. The repair didn't take long after that, maybe 20 minutes more. The new fuel pump settled into place with a satisfying click, and the engine, tired but willing, rumbled back to life like it had simply needed someone to believe in it. Ellie stepped back, wiped her hands on an old rag, and let the hood fall shut with a thud that echoed through the garage. The man pulled out his wallet, thumbing through bills with the same slow precision she'd seen in his stance all night. He didn't ask the price, just held the money out like it was a given, but Ellie shook her head. "You've had a long day," she said quietly. "Just get home safe." He paused, wallet still open, studying her like he was trying to decide whether to argue or just accept what this moment was. Then he nodded, tucked the bills away, and offered a look that wasn't quite a smile, but close. "Thank you," he said. Simple, honest. Ellie gave a small shrug as if it was nothing. But when the truck pulled away and disappeared into the night rain, she stood there for a while longer, Not moving, not thinking, just listening to the echo of it all. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky still held a stubborn gray. Ellie came in early as she always did, flipping on the lights and unlocking the side door before setting her coffee down beside the register. The garage was quiet, almost too quiet. Just the faint hum of cooling air and the lingering scent of wet concrete. She moved through her usual routine, checking the logbook, wiping down the counters until something on the floor near the truck bay caught her eye. A small glint. She knelt down, brushed away a bit of dust, and picked it up. It was a silver ring, simple, worn smooth with time. On the inside, just barely legible, was an engraving. 4CR. You fixed my world. She turned it over slowly in her hand, thumb tracing the words again and again. The man hadn't mentioned losing anything, hadn't acted like he'd left a thing behind. And yet... Here it was. Ellie stared at it for a long moment. Not sure why, but part of her didn't want to put it away. Not yet. The ring sat on the edge of Ellie's desk for days. She didn't wear it, didn't tuck it into a drawer, just left it there where the morning light would catch its curve and throw soft reflections onto the workbench. She thought about calling someone, leaving a note on the community board, maybe asking around town if anyone knew a man driving a red semi through a rainstorm that night. But she didn't. Something about him made her feel like maybe she wasn't supposed to. So, instead, she just kept working. Monday came and went. A couple of brake jobs, a busted radiator, the usual small-town business. By Wednesday, she'd almost convinced herself the whole thing had been just a long, wet night and nothing more. Almost. Because every time she glanced at that ring still sitting there quiet and out of place, something tugged at her. Not quite a question, but definitely not an answer either. It was just past 2 in the morning when the phone rang. Ellie woke with a jolt, heart pounding like something had already gone wrong. She sat up in bed, blinked at the red numbers on the clock, then reached for the receiver on the counter by the front door. Not many people called her at that hour, not unless it was bad news. She answered with a cautious, "Hello?" There was a pause just long enough to make her wonder if it was a wrong number. Then a man's voice, low and steady, came through the line. "Thank you," he said, "for not asking questions." Ellie opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the line clicked. Silence. She stood there for a while, phone still in her hand, staring into the dark kitchen as the dial tone hummed in her ear. No caller ID, no voicemail, no explanation, just those 5 words, and a feeling that whatever had started that night in the rain wasn't finished yet. By morning, Ellie had almost convinced herself the call had been a dream, the kind that clings to your skin even after coffee and a hot shower. Still, she didn't mention it to anyone, not that there were many people to tell, just Mrs. Lane at the post office and Hank, who ran the feed store, and neither seemed the type for strange midnight stories. She unlocked the garage as usual, lights buzzing to life overhead. The scent of oil and dust welcomed her like it always did. Jobs trickled in an alternator swap, a tired transmission, a kid with a lawnmower that wouldn't start. Routine things. Familiar. But something felt off. Not wrong exactly, just shifted. She caught herself glancing toward the desk more than once where the silver ring still sat quiet and unclaimed. It was silly, she thought, but that ring, that call, that man, they weren't fading the way things usually did around here. They were lingering. And deep down, Ellie knew some stories don't just pass through. Some stay. Even when no one says a word. The days kept coming like they always did. Sunrise, coffee socket wrenches. A broken-down van on Tuesday. A timing belt on Thursday. By Friday, Ellie had changed 2 sets of brake pads and rewired a starter that someone's cousin had tried and failed to fix with duct tape. The rhythm of it all was comforting in its own way. But inside that rhythm, there was a silence she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't the kind that filled the garage when the tools were quiet. It was the kind that followed her home. At night, she'd sit by the window with the lights off, cup of tea growing cold in her hands, watching the road like she was waiting for someone who never said they'd come back. The ring stayed on the desk. She never moved it, didn't touch it, didn't want to forget it was there. Because in a life full of engines and oil and things that could be fixed, that ring reminded her some things come into your world not to be repaired, but to ask if you're still listening. And quietly, she was. It was a slow Saturday, the kind where time stretches long between customers. Ellie had just finished rotating tires on a '92 Buick when Mr. Dempsey wandered in. He came by, sometimes didn't need much, just liked to talk engines and sip gas station coffee. He leaned against the counter, eyes on the photos lining the wall, old snapshots of the shop from before it was hers. Before it was anyone's, really. "Your dad ever talk about the guys he worked with?" he asked, pointing at a black-and-white photo of 3 young men in grease-stained uniforms. Ellie looked over, nodding slowly. "Not much. Bits and pieces. Why," Dempsey tapped the glass. "That one there. Paul used to mention him. Rollins, I think. Tom Rollins. They did roadside service together back in the day, maybe during his base years." Ellie's hand stopped mid-wipe on the counter. Rollins. She said it soft, like the name had been asleep inside her for years and was only now waking up. The ring on the desk caught a sliver of sunlight. It flashed once quiet but undeniable. And suddenly, she wasn't just thinking about a stranger in a storm anymore. She was thinking about her father, and the things he never said out loud. That evening, after she closed the shop and locked the bay doors, Ellie found herself standing in front of the old cabinet in the back room. She hadn't touched it in years. It was her father's, a dented metal filing box with a sticky drawer that groaned every time it opened. Inside were receipts from the '80s, a few faded photos, and one envelope, tucked beneath a folded, oil-stained rag. It had no stamp. Just a name on the front in her father's unmistakable handwriting, Tom Rollins. Ellie sat down slowly, the envelope in her hands. She opened it carefully. The paper inside was yellowed, the ink soft with age. A few lines scribbled like they were written in a rush. "If this ever finds you, Tom, just know I never forgot what you did for me. I told my daughter stories about you, but I never told her the most important one. Maybe you'll be the one to do that someday." There was no date, no return address, just her father's signature, simple, firm, and final. Ellie stared at it for a long time, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in that garage. She felt like someone somehow had been here all along. The next day started like any other. Ellie opened the garage just after 7. The air was cool sky, pale with early sun, and the only sound came from a pair of crows bickering in the distance. She swept the floor, poured herself a mug of burnt coffee from yesterday's pot, and tried unsuccessfully not to think about the letter tucked in her coat pocket. At 8:12, she heard it. A low rumble, heavy tires on gravel. She stepped outside, rag still in hand, and froze. Parked just beyond the lot was a massive flatbed trailer, chrome-shining engine idling low. Atop it sat a full set of professional-grade tools, hydraulic lifts, a gleaming compressor, sealed crates with the Snap-on logo stamped on each side. Everything she had once circled in catalogs, then closed the page knowing she couldn't afford it. A man in a delivery uniform climbed down, clipboard in hand. "Ellie Carson?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Got a delivery for you." From who, she asked. The man glanced at his paperwork, then looked back at her. "Doesn't say. No invoice, no return info. Just a note that says, if she's the right one, the road will lead her there." Ellie stood there, still holding the grease rag like it might explain something. The delivery man walked back to the cab, then returned with a small, weathered envelope. No logo, no postage, just her name handwritten in blue ink across the front. "This came with it," he said. "Said to give it to you directly." She took it with both hands, fingers suddenly clumsy. The paper felt thick, soft, like something old that had waited a long time to be read. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single page folded once the writing slanted and deliberate, like the hand behind it had known exactly what to say. And exactly how hard it would be to say it. "My daughter ran a shop like yours. Before cancer took her, she taught me what grace looked like, not the kind you see, but the kind you feel when someone helps without needing a reason." Ellie's throat tightened. "You reminded me of her. The way you moved, the way you didn't ask, the way you cared when no one else was watching. At the bottom, just a name. Tom Rollins. Her knees didn't give out, but they almost did, and for the first time in a long time, Ellie had to sit down, just to remember how to breathe. Ellie didn't go back inside right away. She sat on the edge of the loading dock letter still open in her lap, the morning sun warming the page like it too wanted her to read it again, and so she did. Slower this time, letting each word settle not just in her mind but somewhere deeper, somewhere she hadn't let anyone reach in a long time. The boxes on the trailer gleamed in the light, expensive, brand-new, more equipment than she could have afforded in 10 years. But none of that was what got to her. It was the way he wrote about his daughter. The grief folded into each sentence, but softened by admiration. The recognition not of her skills, but of her spirit. He hadn't just seen a mechanic in the rain. He'd seen someone who reminded him of someone he'd loved and lost. And now, in the quiet of her lot, surrounded by strangers' generosity and her own disbelief, Ellie realized this wasn't charity. It was a mirror, a message from one soul to another. You matter, even when you don't know it. By mid-afternoon, the delivery truck was gone, leaving only tire tracks in the gravel and a silence that felt different. Ellie stood in the bay door, hands on her hips, staring at the mountain of crates and machinery now sitting in her lot. For a while, she didn't move. Then, almost without thinking, she reached for the crowbar hanging by the pegboard, cracked open the first crate, and peeled back the layers of packaging like she was unwrapping something sacred. Inside, a brand-new hydraulic lift. Glossy red, untouched, like it had been waiting for her. She ran her fingers along the smooth metal edge, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't about the tools. It was about what they meant. A stranger had seen her, really seen her, and somehow, through grief and distance and years of silence, he'd answered a question she hadn't dared to ask. Am I still doing this for something? And now, maybe for the first time in a long time, she was ready to keep going, not just to fix engines, but to rebuild the pieces of herself she thought no one had noticed were broken. She started with the lift. It took her half the morning just to move the old equipment aside. Some of it was rusted, stiff things her father had used before she even learned how to hold a wrench. But she didn't throw anything away. Not yet. Ellie cleared a corner of the garage, swept it clean, and laid down new floor pads for the base. The sound of bolts tightening into concrete echoed different that day. Sharper, fuller, like the building itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. By early afternoon, the lift was up. Next came the tool cabinet, heavy bright red, the kind she'd seen in catalogs but always flipped past like window shopping dreams. She stocked it slowly, each drawer with a set of gleaming tools lined up in perfect rows. Sockets, ratchets, calipers, names she'd whispered to herself for years, like small prayers. She paused, one sturdy gloves resting on the steel edge, and looked around. The shop wasn't new, but it felt awake again. And for the first time in a long time, so did she. At first, it was just a few people slowing down as they passed. The new lift stood tall near the bay door, painted red and gleaming like it didn't quite belong in a building full of scuffed cement and oil stains. It caught the afternoon sun in a way nothing else on that road ever had. Then Mrs. Keller from the diner stopped by with a paper bag of blueberry muffins and a curious smile. "Looks like you're finally letting the place breathe," she said, peering inside. Ellie smiled, a little shy, a little proud. Guess it was time. Later that week, Hank from the feed store dropped off a used tire balancer, said it had been sitting in his shed too long anyway. Figured it'd get more use here, he muttered. Nobody made a big deal of it. But something had shifted. The doorbell chimed more often. A teenager poked his head in to ask if she was hiring. A long-haul trucker pulled in saying he'd heard there's a woman out here who works like she's got nothing to prove. Ellie didn't advertise. She didn't hang a sign. She just showed up, turned the lights on, and let the work speak for itself. It was the kid with the buzz cut who asked first. Came in one afternoon, hands stuffed in hoodie pocket shoes, dragging like he'd rather be anywhere else, but his eyes kept drifting toward the lift, toward the tools, toward the way Ellie moved around the shop like it was part of her. You, Ever teach anybody this stuff? He asked. Voice half mumbled. Ellie raised an eyebrow, glanced over her shoulder. You looking to learn? He shrugged, like he hadn't expected to get that far. By the next morning he was there again, this time with a notebook and gloves. Ellie didn't make a speech, didn't explain what things meant. She just handed him a wrench and said, loosen the lug nuts, counterclockwise. That's how it started. And then, quietly, it kept going. A second kid came by the week after, then a third. Word spread not fast, but steady. She wasn't running a school, but somehow this old garage had turned into something else. Not just a place where things got fixed, but where hands learned the value of work and hearts learned that someone believed in them. Funny thing is, Ellie didn't set out to become anyone's teacher. She never drew up a plan, never hung a flyer. She just kept doing what she'd always done. Show up, get her hands dirty, and tell the truth when it mattered. But looking back, she could see it, the way those kids stood a little straighter after a full day's work. The way they leaned in when she explained torque or timing, or the sound a bad alternator makes when it's about to quit. She didn't realize it at first, but with every bolt they loosened, with every pair of oil-stained gloves hung by the door, she was mending something in herself, too. Not with words, but with motion. Tighten it just enough to hold, not enough to strip, she said one morning, almost to herself, and the boy beside her, maybe 16, looked up and nodded like he understood more than just the bolt, because in that garage lessons didn't always come with a chalkboard. Sometimes they came from a woman who'd stayed quiet for too long but was finally learning how to speak again, one repair at a time. Some things aren't meant to be moved. The flatbed trailer was still there 3 weeks after it arrived. Parked quietly along the side lot, its wheels settled deep into gravel and time. Most folks figured it would be gone by now, hauled back, repurposed, claimed. But Ellie hadn't asked for it to be taken away. She never said it out loud, but she liked knowing it was there. On slow days, she'd find herself drifting toward it, wiping down the rails with an old towel, checking the straps even though nothing had shifted. It was strange what we choose to hold on to. Not the tools, not the money, but the reminder. Because that trailer wasn't just a delivery. It was a turning point, steel and rubber and silence that had split her story clean down the middle. Before the rain, and after the gift. And now, whenever she passed it, she didn't see weight. She saw proof that sometimes people don't just pass through, they stay, even if only in the way you carry them forward. She didn't recognize him at first. He came on foot, no truck, no trailer, just a ball cap pulled low and a quiet way of walking that made him blend into the gravel lot like he belonged there. Ellie was under the hood of an old Dodge when she heard the screen door creak. She wiped her hands, turned, and paused. He gave a small nod like they'd spoken yesterday. Just passing through, he said. Some people don't need an entrance. They carry their meaning in silence. Ellie didn't rush to fill it. She just leaned back on the counter and said, Coffee's still terrible if you want some. He smiled, the same almost smile she remembered from the night of the storm. They sat on the back steps, mugs in hand, watching the late sun stretch shadows across the lot. It wasn't a reunion. It was something quieter. Two people who understood that not all things needed to be said to be felt. And as they sat there with nothing left to explain, Ellie realized something. Sometimes the people who change your life don't come to stay. They just come at the right time, and leave something behind that never leaves you. He didn't start with her. Tom didn't mention his daughter right away. He talked about the road, about gas stations with burnt coffee, about how some trucks never really want to retire. Ellie listened, nodding, letting the space between words do its work. Then, after a long pause, he looked down into his cup and said, Her name was Claire. She ran a garage in Tennessee. Smaller than yours, but she made it hers. Ellie stayed quiet. She worked until the day she couldn't. Cancer doesn't ask for timing. There was no speech, no apology, just the weight of a father who had seen something in Ellie that reminded him of what he'd lost and maybe what he still hoped to pass on. I saw her in you, he said simply. Not in how you fix things, but in why. What he gave her wasn't an explanation. It was a truth. one that wrapped around them like the fading light, gentle, honest, and enough. And for the first time in a long while, Ellie didn't feel like she was carrying the story alone. He didn't say goodbye. He stood slowly stretched like a man who'd been sitting longer than his legs liked, then turned toward the road with that same quiet ease he'd walked in with. Some exits don't need doors, just distance. Ellie walked with him to the edge of the lot, boots crunching over gravel, the sky blushing with late-day gold. "Keep this going," Tom said, nodding toward the garage. "You're making more than repairs in there." She didn't ask when or if he'd be back, because some people aren't meant to stay in your life. They're meant to tilt it just enough for you to see it differently. She watched him walk until the curve in the road took him. No wave, no backward glance, just the slow rhythm of a man who had come full circle and left something better behind. And when she turned to go back inside, Ellie felt it in her chest, quiet, steady, and sure. This was no longer just a garage. It was a place where stories began again. Life didn't change overnight, but something had shifted. The next morning, Ellie rolled up the bay doors like she always did. Same keys, same squeaky hinge, same breath in the cool air before the day began. But everything felt just a little more awake. She still worked with her hands tightened, bolts checked brakes, traced oil leaks like a detective. But now each movement carried something else, a steadiness, a trust. Like she finally believed in what she was building, not just machines, but meaning. Funny how hope never knocks. It just walks in like it's always lived there. The kids kept coming. The regulars stayed longer drinking coffee from chipped mugs that never seemed to empty. People asked more questions, and she had more answers, not all of them technical. And through it all, the trailer remained at the edge of the lot, quiet, unmoved, but never ignored. It didn't need to go anywhere. It had already delivered what it came for. She didn't plan to stop. She just did. Late afternoon light spilled through the open bay door, casting long golden slants across the concrete. The tools were clean. The lift stood silent. The radio hummed something soft in the background. Ellie leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, a quiet calm settling in her chest. Some moments don't ask to be marked. They just stay with you. She looked around. At the walls her father had patched. At the new cabinet filled with tools she never thought she'd touch. At the ring still on the corner of the desk where it had always been. It wasn't about what had changed. It was about what had finally made sense. That kindness. Real kindness never asks for recognition. It just shows up sometimes in a storm, sometimes in a flatbed trailer, sometimes in the quiet way a stranger sees you and believes in what you haven't yet become. And in that moment, Ellie didn't feel like someone who had been rescued. She felt like someone who had arrived. Looking back now, Ellie never could have planned it. Not the storm, not the man in the soaked flannel, not the trailer, not the tools, not even the quiet sentence that changed the shape of her days. "You reminded me of her." But that's the thing with stories like this. They don't knock. They don't announce themselves. They just arrive soft, steady when you least expect. And most need them. Not all gifts come wrapped in ribbons. Some come in calloused hands and silence. Some come in a letter written years too late. And some come in the form of belief, from someone you barely knew but somehow knew you. Ellie still works at that same garage, still teaches kids how to listen to engines and to themselves, still wipes her tools clean at the end of every day, but now she leaves the lights on a little longer, just in case someone else is out there driving through the rain looking for help, not knowing they're about to change a life. Maybe yours, maybe someone else's, or maybe quietly your own. If you've ever been helped without asking or helped someone without needing a reason, leave a comment with just 2 words, "I remember." Because kindness never disappears, it just keeps finding its way back.